Happy Halloween. Leave now while you still can.
Leave now before Master finds you. Who is that knocking at my door? Who is that knocking at my door?
Who is that knocking at my door? Be gone with you.
Hello everyone, once again it's October, it's time for more horror movie review franchise. After reviewing the Universal Monsters series the last 2 years on my YouTube channel for horror franchise movie review month this year, we are heading to England. It's Hammer time. Before I start this review, a little brief history background. Hammer's a British studio in England that produced movies. Not only did they make horror movies, they made thrillers, murder mysteries, Sherlock Holmes movies, and sci-fi movies back in the 1930s, 40s, and early 50s. Before this movie, they made the Quatermass sci-fi movies. Around this time in horror film history in the 1950s, the horror genre was dead because people were more afraid of the real-life horrors from post-World War II. They were also afraid of the fear of the Cold War. Not to say there were horror movies in the 1950s. It wasn't being taken seriously. It was being played for laughs or gimmicks like the William Castle movies or the Teenage Werewolf or other cheesy teenage B-horror movies. Hammer made the horror genre popular again. The Universal Monster series was dead. The Creature from the Black Lagoon was the last best monster movie. After that, they made sci-fi B-movies that were hit or miss. This Island Earth, The Mole People, and Tarantula. Hammer took the risk of remaking the Universal Monster classics. Even though I'm not a big fan of reboots, these movies are great and an exception for me. I do love and have great respect for Hammer, love both Universal and Hammer equally, but as a preference, I love Universal more, but that's just me. Part of the reason is because I grew up on Universal Monsters and discovered the Hammer movies later in my life. Around this time when people thought of Frankenstein, Dracula, the Wolfman, the Mummy, Universal was the first thing that came to mind of the monsters. No one thought it was necessary to remake the classic monsters, and nobody thought no one could top Universal until Hammer took a risk. Some people argue these movies as reboots or reimaginations. In my opinion, they are a combination of both. They are reboots because it's a remake of Frankenstein, and a reimagination because Hammer made Frankenstein their own without copying what Universal did, and they did not make them shot-for-shot remakes. They didn't watch Universal's Frankenstein from 1931 and just copy it frame for frame. As I said before, my feelings on remakes, to me, in my opinion, these are the best remakes of horror movies. I'm glad Hammer made these movies their own, not copying what Universal did. If Hammer did that, they would have gotten sued by Universal. I'm also glad they don't call this movie Frankenstein alone. Again, to avoid getting sued by Universal, they call this movie The Curse of Frankenstein. What also makes the Hammer movies different from Universal, these movies were shot in color. Gothic atmosphere with nice shots of castle gargoyles, had little gore and cleavage. This made Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee the new horror stars of the late 1950s, 60s, and 1970s. They were the modern new Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi. Unlike Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi, who were not friends but respected each other in real life, Lee and Cushing were the best of friends offset when they were not making movies together. This was not the first movie they even did together. They worked on a movie before this, but they had no scenes together. This was how they met the first time. For reading how they first met, Cushing met Lee when Christopher Lee was wearing the monster makeup, when the monster's faces were revealed to Dr. Frankenstein. This movie also made film director Terence Fisher an A-list director, and would go on to direct other Hammer horror movies. Before, he wasn't a well-known director, yet until these Hammer horror movies pushed an edge on his career. Peter Cushing is great in this movie. Unlike Colin Clive as Dr. Frankenstein, Universal Monsters Frankenstein, who was two-dimensional, starts off as an evil mad scientist. After seeing his failed creation was a mistake, he decides to help the town villagers destroy his creation. In this version of Dr. Frankenstein, he is flat out pure evil. He has no feelings or remorse at all. He cares about his work. He doesn't care about anyone else. He's also very ruthless and a murderer. He's a real bastard. He's animated in his work. The opening scene takes place in the present moment when Dr. Frankenstein is arrested and he tells his POV, like the opening scene to the cabinet of Dr. Caligari. You don't know if the story was real or was he mentally insane. It was all in his head. Dr. Frankenstein tells a priest a story going far back to the beginning when he was a little boy who plays the young Baron Frankenstein. The kid actor looks nothing like Peter Cushing, not even close. Frankenstein explains how from an early age he was taught science and found science very fascinating and was hoping that someday he would do something different that no other man has done in the history of science, bring a dead person back to life and playing God. He's been studying science and being mentored by Professor Klemper. The part when Dr. Frankenstein tricks a professor showing an art photo and he pushes him off the balcony of the stairs, it makes Colin Clive Dr. Frankenstein version look less evil and mad. Compared to Colin Clive and Peter Cushing, it's hard to pick who was the better Dr. Frankenstein. They both brought different uniqueness to the character and made it their own version. As much as I love Universal and respect to Colin Clive, I pick Peter Cushing as the best Dr. Frankenstein. Dr. Frankenstein is a man whore. There's a subplot of Frankenstein two-timing his fiancée cousin Elizabeth with the maid's name Justine. Yes, that is correct. You heard me right. It's disturbing to say that because this takes place in the 19th century, back when it was common for cousins to marry each other, whereas in today's modern world, not an exception. Sorry if I grossed you out and disturbed you by saying that. The actress who played Elizabeth was not a bad character or a bad acting performance. She could have had a more arc in this movie. She's not memorable as the original Elizabeth from Universal. Elizabeth thinks she knew Victor very well because of how Victor helped Elizabeth and her mother financially. You can also say she was blinded for obviously not knowing about Victor's affair with the maid Justine. Justine's the maid who's in love with Frankenstein, but she's wasting her time with him. She tries to blackmail him if Frankenstein does not marry her, but sadly she is murdered. Despite the marriage being arranged, Victor and Elizabeth don't really know each other that well, and they hardly grew up together or saw each other until years later when they were adults. In the Frankenstein novel, Frankenstein and Elizabeth grew up together, but Frankenstein really does not care or love these women. All he cares about is sex and his work. He basically would have married his work over the women. Professor Paul Kleppner is the protagonist of this movie. He was Victor's friend and mentor. He cared for him like a father figure. But Paul sees how Dr. Frankenstein becomes so obsessed with his work, he goes too far when he's trying to play God. He tried his best to help and save Victor, but Victor sadly turned into a monster. Paul's against Frankenstein's work because of knowing how it's too risky and dangerous, and like anything else, there's always consequences, and the downside of doing what Frankenstein wants to accomplish no man has ever done before in the history of science. As I mentioned before in other sci-fi horror reviews, we all think science is this amazing thing, but science fails. Paul believes playing God is not a good idea, and that nature should take its course. I don't blame Paul for telling Elizabeth to leave because of the danger and risk she's at about marrying a monster. Another thing what I love about this movie is unlike most modern day horror remakes that try too hard, this movie does not try too hard at all whatsoever. It's a natural remake, reimagination. Some people have said and pointed out how this is a good Hammer film, but because it was the first Hammer horror movie at the time, the movie's not quite there yet, and we see in later in Horror of Dracula when Hammer was getting better and improving with a bigger budget and better set designs. Terrence Fisher probably learned a lot from making this movie, and got better and applied what he learned from making this movie when he directed Horror of Dracula. But I still like this movie for what it is, but I can respect why the movie would not be highly as a future of Hammer horror movies, because it was only the beginning for Hammer's future success in horror movies, again the horror genre back on track. As mentioned before, with Hammer trying not to copy Universal, I like how we see the monster escape. There are some homages to Universal, but different of course. When the monster escapes from Dr. Frankenstein's laboratory, he meets the blind man in the woods. Unlike Bride of Frankenstein, the monster and the blind man have a friendship. In this, it's a misunderstanding. The monster kills the blind man, but we don't see it. We're left in suspense thinking what the monster could have done to the blind man. Either the blind man was killed or maybe fainted in shock. The set designs are cool. I love the laboratory sets. James Bernard's score to this movie is excellent. When we are first introduced to the monster, the makeup may not be as iconic or not as good as Jack Pierce's Frankenstein monster makeup, but it's not too bad. Again, because it's a reimagination, Hammer really did their best to avoid getting sued by Universal for not copying Jack Pierce's makeup. Even though Christopher Lee does a good job in this movie as the monster, he is not the main focus like in the original Universal Frankenstein, where the monster had a big arc and personality. The monster is a small side character and takes a back seat. Dr. Frankenstein is more the main focus in this movie. The monster has no dialogue like in the original, or how in the novel the creature becomes smart and speaks intelligently. Christopher Lee was a smart man. If they gave him dialogue, it would have been a great dramatic Shakespearean performance as the monster for Lee. But just like in the original Frankenstein movie, the creature tries to understand things, but has a hard time gravitating towards things and learning. He is misunderstood. I don't blame Paul for telling Elizabeth to leave because of the danger and risk she's at about to marry a monster. Also, it could potentially have been an abusive, neglectful, unhealthy marriage. This movie's also been pointing out this movie is a semi-almost true to the original Mary Shelley Frankenstein novel, which you can say is somewhat true, but it's still like not 100% faithful to the novel. In the Universal Monsters Frankenstein first movie, the rest of the series, there aren't any like angry villagers like in the first Frankenstein movie where Dr. Frankenstein helps the angry villagers who use pitchfork, other weapons, and fire to help destroy the creation of the monster, and they're angry at God. The original Frankenstein is still my favorite Frankenstein adaptation, but I still have a lot of respect for this movie and giving the Hammer credit for redefining horror, making the horror genre better and popular again. So that was my review of The Curse of Frankenstein. Stay tuned for more horror movie reviews for this month of October. See you next time.